this counter that freedom's more than tit for tat. Words can build or words can break. Speak the truth for all our sake. A hand that feeds can also bind, but peace can free a restless mind. Fix the cracks, don't paint them bright. The world's not whole without the fight. So rise and speak, don't just comply. Change the script, don't live the lie. Counter this, counter that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Counter This. Today, we were going to talk about immigration enforcement with my buddy Zach, who is back, but LBC had to take today off. So we're going to save that for next week, and Zach will be here for that one as well. But Zach brought up revolution last time, and we left a whole lot to be discussed for this time. So we're going to touch more on that topic. Thank you for joining me today, Zach. How are you doing?
Oh man, I'm doing wonderful. It is a great day to talk about controversies, and I hope everyone is excited for a second part of this episode.
Well, thank you for joining me again, and I hope everyone enjoys this. But before we get into all of the discussions, I do kind of want to preface this conversation with this opening here. Today, we're talking about one of the most dangerous words in politics, revolution. And not the movie version, not the romantic poster, but the real thing. The moment when people decide that institutions above them stopped listening, stopped representing, and stopped deserving obedience. History show governments rarely fall just because crowds are angry. They fall when legitimacy cracks, power fractures, and someone else is ready to grab the wheel. So here's the real question at the table. Are we witnessing normal political frustrations or the early ingredients to something bigger? And we kind of got a checklist to kind of answer these questions here. And it's a three-parter. And it's why do revolutions happen? Well, there's three reasons. Legitimacy. Do we have enough people who still believe the government has the right to rule? Capacity. Can it still enforce order and provide basics? And then three, cohesion. Are elites, the military, the police, and the bureaucracy unified? And if one fails, you get a little bit of turbulence. If two fails, you get crisis. And if three fail, your regime's highly in danger. So, Zach, I know we got that three-parter there. Do you believe the government still has that right to rule? Or are you seeing kind of a lot of disagreement here around America?
Yeah, well, it's a loaded question. So, I would point back to the Constitution. So, if you really want to judge how our country is supposed to be ran, right, the government is supposed to serve and be afraid of the people. So, does our government have the legitimacy to continue to run our country? It's a question for the people. Do the people feel heard? Do we feel like the government is using our best interests in mind? I think those are the posing questions. What I've seen, especially recently, is the common vote and the common ideology doesn't appear to be the decision. It seems like, especially, even in our local elections, there is always a majority vote, and maybe it's because mainstream media only locks in what you want to hear and see, but I feel like just the common people's voice isn't being heard. So is the government really leading the people? Is it doing its job, or is it doing what it needs to do to stay in power?
I mean, and that's a very good question because I mean, you brought it up with mainstream media and things like that. But like when mainstream media talks about a bunch of the key issues, there's a large consensus from both left and right on a lot of these issues. They just highlight the fringes, which has really accelerated that aspect where the government doesn't seem to be following the rule of the majority. And while the rule of the majority might be 70% about an issue, the government seems to be giving us the middle finger.
Yeah,
So,
and how do we even know if it's a true, what does the true people want? Because in this day and age, when I go to look on whatever social media app you choose, you are directed content that aligns most closely with what you're going to engage with. So everyone has this big idea that, oh, the majority of the people where I live think this, or the majority think this because this is all I see. It might not be the case. It might not be the truth. And that is really skewing people's idea of, is the government listening to me? I just saw yesterday, actually, that there was a law passed in our state that now kids under the age of 16 are no longer allowed to make minimum wage, which I believe is 15.75. Their wages are now 13.50. And it was passed by voted in legislator representatives, but the people voted against it.
mhm.
So and see, I'm told the people voted against it, and that the legislative made that decision to vote for it. Is that true? Am I being fed content that I believe is true that might not be? Did people vote for it? Did we vote against it? I have no idea in this day and age, and I try to keep up to date on political issues. And so it's really interesting when you get to a country size scale. Are the majority issues being solved? How do we know? Where's the check and balance? Or is the government really just giving us the middle finger because they know there is, a house divided falls much easier than a house together? Is the idea to keep everyone fighting against each other so they can stay in power?
Uh, I would say that that is one of the more effective tools that they use. And you highlight key points where it's very hard to know if you actually if the government is actually serving the will of the people, and you really have to go out there and search for what the opposition to what you think is saying. And I think that's a big part of what is missed online. We did have that second part question, and this one I feel is more of a yes in my eyes. But can the government still enforce order and provide the basics?
Yeah. So you say yes. You think they have the capacity to, and I believe that the capacity is there, um, because we allow it to be.
Mhm.
I truly think that if, and it's been shown in recent events, Minnesota being one of them, as well as California, New York, um, when the people get upset about something or are not understanding or have even um, emotional action, when enough people decide to do that, it becomes really hard to enforce laws and order with the current capacity. That's why we've seen the National Guard deployed in a couple places. We've seen backup from other states sending law enforcement or more government officials. Same with polling. Same with, even I remember when the government was shut down for a while and TSA was having problems. Um, TSA has problems when the government's not shut down, and TSA is part of the government. They're government regulated. So, is the capacity there? It's there. Our country wouldn't function without it. Is it there if enough people want to break that section? I don't think so.
Well, and that's a big highlight to the revolution, where it's like did it's it functions if we don't challenge it, and I would say that a lot of it might not necessarily be a job of the government. Like, should the job of the government be maybe TSA, maybe parts of TSA, but overall, could you privatize TSA and it work fine? Probably. So a lot of these don't necessarily need to be a part of the government. And I think if you took some of those out, you might be able to do some of these other things a little more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, priorities and capacity go hand in hand. When your priorities are skewed, um, other parts lack. I mean, we saw it under a different administration with border security, which happens to be the topic next week. There was a skew in priorities over an administration change, and you see the extremes of both. And it's not because the capacity changed; it's because the priority changed.
Hmm.
And so that's where, again, capacity, priority, hand in hand. Um, I think that if on the topic of does our government have capacity to continue to control our country and run it effectively, it would be interesting to see what happens if the American people challenge every aspect of that capacity. It would be very interesting to see because it doesn't happen often. And when it does, it seems to be effective. So is our capacity not there, or is the control behind the government incorrect? Is their priority skewed? Should they be putting more efforts into certain aspects of control and country welfare that they're not?
Mm. And I mean, that's a big question that is normally answered with revolution. We did have a third part to that questioning on, are we witnessing normal political frustrations, or is this the early ingredients to something far bigger? And that part three was cohesion, and it's our elites, military, police, and bureaucracy unified. And I think we both will have the same answer on this one.
Y- You know, this is the first time that I believe, or the, I guess, only time that America, United States, has had multiple government shutdowns due to lack of cohesion in our government. I mean, it's the most ever. So it's interesting to see that because we see large branches of government divided. We see a large divide of our House, our senators, um, even people that are financially politically involved are completely divided. We've gone to a point now where celebrity figures are more than endorsing. They're endorsing financially, visibly through media. They're even calling on their fans to be one-sided. And I don't believe that our founding fathers or even the definition of democracy calls for division in that scale. It's healthy and almost called for people not to agree, which is okay. Disagreeing with someone with different opinions and views is totally fine. But when you start attacking and trying to viciously remove people with that ideology, it there can't be cohesion.
Hmm.
Negative and positive are completely different, but they need each other to stick together. If you have two positives, two negatives, they fight. Well, right now that's what's happening. It's we don't have a cohesive. There's nothing to stick together. It's just they're pushing against each other, and eventually it breaks, or one of them loses.
Yep. And I mean, that's really, really something we agree on. Uh, Elites, they're not cohesive right now. Military, more cohesive. You did see some when new rules were passed when Trump first took office. There was a little bit of uncohesiveness, but they seem to be more unified now. You do have police that are very ununified in our country right now. Some don't want to follow certain rules. Some heavily want to enforce other rules. So, not very unified there. And then your bureaucracy, the government itself, is heavily, heavily divided. So,
Interesting thought behind that is: do we see divide more throughout federal agencies or federally um, overseen actions, or do we see more divide statewide? And that because, for instance, I'll use California for an example. There was a long time there where the administration in California didn't want to involve the National Guard. They were having issues with protesting, rioting, looting, um, and they didn't want to involve a federal support network of policing. And they needed the, funny enough, capacity to help control some of those issues. And so was that more motivated behind the administration in that state alone, or the actual, policing union of the state? Because when I look at federal agencies, I see a lot of cohesion, and it's hard not to be when the directors are appointed. Um, you know, if they want to keep their job, it's kind of in their best interest to be cohesive with the other administrations and other leaders. But we see states kind of taking their own stand. Minnesota, also the same. They wanted to hold off on federal help as long as possible, and eventually they let it come in. Um, and then you look kind of at Texas, Arizona, Nevada, that welcomed federal help, trying to police some of the issues there with border security and immigration reform. So, you see a complete night and day between some of these predominantly right sided and left sided states. Where's the motivation coming from? Is it from the people? Is it from the actual unions of police officers and governments? Or is it straight from administration leadership?
Mm.
Or a mix
And
of all three?
I would say more of a mix. Some of the people, but like they're amplifying certain voices in some of these areas, which is what you highlighted on legitimacy. And these are things we've seen before in history. To give like a brief overview, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about like the Cuban Revolution, and we got the Russian Revolution in here. We also will touch a little bit on obviously the American Revolution. We also got India in here and France, and little tie-ins to the Chinese Revolution that we've seen happen. These are all revolutions within the past century. So to really start it off, you had Cuba, where elections were meaningless. It didn't matter if you voted for anyone, because you just had Batista, who was in charge and would always get elected, no matter if the people voted for him or didn't. You had armed opposition. Um, and these are things that will kind of tie into the more modern conversation. And you had the revolution, the centralized authority. Russia, you had a failure of credibility after going through World War One. You had army mutinies. You had two governments really competing with each other, which is something that heavily ties into what we're seeing right now. You also had the United States breaking from an empire very, very similar to what we watched within India. You had immediate fear of chaos, kind of something that we're looking at right now. Also, in that Indian revolution, you had a negotiated transfer, which is kind of something we might touch a little bit on in our conversation going over revolution in general. But you also had an enormous administrative shock that left to heavy democratic competition afterwards, which is also something that you saw in France. France's was more a fiscal crisis with inequality, kind of something that we saw in China as well. You had a monarchy that was absolutely paralyzed, very, very similar to what we saw in China. Radicalization that escalates. And that was something also, again, very, very similar to China. Where you kind of differ in that Chinese one is that one was more like Cuba, with your armed opposition that survived long enough to really challenge the legitimacy of your government. So we'll kind of open this one up to get into the deeper conversation of revolution in general. Kind of highlight what we're seeing now, kind of how it correlates to what we've seen in the past, and maybe discuss a little bit about maybe how we solve this, or does it need solved? Should we just let history repeat itself and get to somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, lots to touch on. Interesting thing about kind of all of those end results and those different revolutions is. And really the only one comparable to us in size is Russia. And Russia's specific revolution happened at the lowest point in the country. They had over 5 million in losses from the World War One, between prisoners, citizens dying, famine, disease, over that course of that war. So in our case, there is we are one of the largest countries by land mass, and our population is so spread out, and states have so many different accesses to laws to abide by, and general consensus. It it makes our situation very unique compared to some of these other revolutionary revolutions that happen in these countries. Is they weren't dealing with masses of land over these revolutions. All of the population was concentrated. And so it's interesting to see, because nowadays, and you hear it all the time, if you don't like it what happens in your state, move to a different one, because they have different rules and laws and people that live there. It wasn't like that in Russia. It wasn't like that in Cuba. It wasn't like that in France. It was, that was, you're moving to a new country, completely different laws and rules, and sometimes you couldn't get there. So it's interesting to see that we have all of the same problems, poor execution, poor management of these problems, but the results are different. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Russia specifically. So in Russia's case, again, they lost a lot of people. There were there was a huge military coup. There was a huge amount of famine, and protesters. I believe it was the picketing, known as, where 100,000 people were out marching, protesting the government, and a czar change, which was just kind of unheard of at the time. I mean, czars were royalty. They had everyone backing them, and if they didn't get backed, you weren't there anymore. You weren't a challenge. So Russia was a really interesting example of what can happen when a bottle of everything bad is all put together.
Well, and the key point you brought up a little bit, where that picketing, where the people were out in the streets, they weren't there to really challenge the authority of the government. They were there to beg the czar to fix it. They still believed in the system. And what really changed that was, at first you had your military there that was ordered to execute citizens because they were petitioning the czar. And this very, very quickly turned into a military revolution where the military, instead of siding with the people, or instead of siding with the government like it happened before, this time the military decides that it's going to side with the people. They very, very quickly overtook the entire capital. They overthrew the military barracks, gave arms to the people. They stormed the palace, and they forced the czar to step down. In this case, the czar was not killed. He was forced to step down. And now you had two governments that were fighting for authority. There was the government that had already been put in place, and then you had your provisional government. This was a provisional government that was known as the Soviet, and this was people that had elected local representation to go there and represent themselves. And this is kind of where you see that part two revolution, because the Russian Revolution wasn't just that single part. You were left with that, and then your Bolshevik uprising, which is that part two that everyone really focuses on when they talk about the Russian Revolution. Because they really tried to work things out. You had your original government and then your provisional government that were trying to figure out how to run the country.
Yeah,
Provisional.
you had two revolutions, that changed the country completely, like 7 months apart.
Hmm.
One was in February, one was in October. And the crazy thing about the February one, and it really ties into our first kind of question over this whole series, is it was a legitimacy collapse that got too big to police. That was the issue. Two of our main points, legitimacy and capacity, were both passed in that February revolution. And then the second part of the revolution was more of a very weakened party that overtook the czar was pushed out because they were too weak again to handle the capacity and cohesion of the people. Legitimacy was there. They took over the government, but they were weak. They didn't have the capacity to continue to run.
Oh yeah. And I mean, it's something that we see kind of today where there seems to be two separate governments that are really fighting. And it's not more itself of like two separate government entities, but two separate governmental parties, which is a little bit similar to what you saw there. You saw the old guard that really wanted to keep Russia the way that it was, that you had your oligarchs and your people in power and the elites, and then there was the peasant class, and then your provisional government really wanted to shake it all up. They wanted a new hierarchy, and that's really what that revolution was more so about, was that the old hierarchy wasn't working. The government couldn't really hold that hierarchy in place anymore, and it wasn't very cohesive.
Well, I mean,
And
not to mention they were going through a war like that.
mhm,
I mean, the people were upset. No one wanted to be in war anymore. They had
mhm.
already lost so many people. At the actual community and culture of the country was declining rapidly. It No one believed the government was taking best interests in mind. It felt like that the government was doing as much as possible to gain control of over the country rather than solve the issues.
Oh, definitely. And like this also ties into one of the bigger problems you see with revolution, where you had a legitimate revolution that was going into place. You had legitimate reasons for this to happen. A lot of those checkpoints that we had on our list were hit, and extremely hit. But then you see a revolution absolutely captured by the Bolsheviks, and this led the country into about 80 years that really highlighted a push to a new revolution. Absolutely captured. You have your hierarchy replaced with a completely new hierarchy, which is one thing that, if we were going to see some kind of revolution here, and we were going to have, say, our current political system toppled, and they removed Donald Trump from power, are they just going to replace him with the same nonsense but on the other side? And would anybody be happy about it?
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting to look at the Bolsheviks because they, I mean, that regime brought ideology back, country culture. I mean, it was a complete new kind of government, and not saying it was the perfect or even ideal, but it worked. And that's the key point is it worked. It helped the people become more unified and cohesive. Um, and that's something that we look at now. And I agree, is you get rid of, and it's really interesting too, because I've had this discussion with a lot of my friends. So obviously, Trump can't run again. You can have serve 2 terms. Now he can be vice president, blah, blah, blah. I've heard the spiel. It's not going to happen. But, anyways, let's play, devil's advocate. JD Vance is the next Republican candidate. What happens then? It's no longer Trump. For years they've screamed racist, pedophile, and, business mogul, non-politician. All of a sudden, are we going to get a bunch of skeletons out of the closet of JD Vance? Was he on the Epstein Island too? Like, what is going to be the media machine's idea behind making the big bad wolf? And same on the other side. Right now, there's no clear precedent for the Democratic Party for next election. I mean, and thankfully they'll have 4 years in total to figure out that next candidate and not try to rush one into the party. But what skeletons, what horrible person are they going to come up with? It's It seems like it's always the worst choice possible running for these parties, and we're entering a new era of political voices because the Bushes ran for a while, Obama, Biden, the Clintons, Trump. So we're out of these high ticket last names.
Mhm.
All of those people were super mainstream media um, in politics. I'm thinking right now is I don't have a next last name that I'm like, oh yeah, they've been in politics for years and I have a really strong opinion about them. It'll be really interesting to see what the replacements look like and if it's still a huge political divide.
Oh, definitely. And you really highlighted the problem, and it's the old guard. You know, the old guard is dying off. You got Mitch McConnell, who's really no longer fit to run. You have Nancy Pelosi finally stepping down. These are all of those old guard members that have been in politics their entire life, who have shaped the country in their own image, and now you're gone. You are no longer one fit to run. You're no longer alive, or you can't run anymore. And what are we seeing? We're seeing a younger group kind of taking that forefront, and it's kind of all up in the air right now, which this is kind of more of one of those times where the American people could actually make their voices heard. This transition from old guard to new guard could really change things up in a way where we could put off a revolution, where we might be able to redirect the country back to the will of the people. Is it going to be allowed to happen, though? That's the big question.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's who is controlling things behind closed doors is the question. Um, and it's the tale of time. Um, you don't get into a high seat of administration without sponsorships and money. That's one thing that Trump was able to do was spend a lot of his own money, and he spent a crap ton of it to get to where he is. It's a pay to play scheme. So, and now in today's day and age, it's a little cheaper to pay to play. Mainstream media makes it so you throw, a couple $100,000 at some electronic digital advertising, and you can get a lot of exposure for a lot cheaper than some of these older elections. So it really opens the door to anyone, with a little bit of backing and some sponsorships can run. um, are those sponsorships controlling who ends up in place? Is or will we see a complete change in the old guard to new guard where people aren't bought in because it's not as expensive to pay to play? We're in a much more modern time where it'll be really interesting to see in the next, I would say, 3 elections to really see how they turn out. And again, are for the last couple of years, everyone was like, "Are these really the two people we have to choose from? Like, this is
Mhm.
out of everyone we could have picked in the entire United States, these are the people we chose." It'll turn more into who are these people? Let's learn a little bit more about them. I don't know anything about them. I knew the last names of the last, you know, 5, 6 presidents, but I don't know these last names. I don't know anything about them. It'll be really interesting to see.
Well, and this really ties into why I brought up the Indian Revolution, because the Indian Revolution is a little bit different. They kind of went and challenge the authority of the UK government. But for the most part, most of the Indian Revolution was extremely peaceful. And this was more just a transfer of power from the UK back to the Indian people. They gave the power back in 1947 with the Indian Independence Act, and they ordered the India and Pakistan to really take back control of their governments through it, through you know their own voting systems, instead of it being, well, here's your representation and we have our UK people that we have positioned in these places to run these regions. You are now having democracy, which hadn't happened there. Before it was a caste based system where you had your elites and your elite families just kind of ruled things, which was, kind of similar to what the UK happened when they came in there, except it was different. You had completely different countries dictating how you were going to run your country. And you really saw that have a little bit of problems there. Mass administration, stress. You had an identity conflict there, which is kind of what we're seeing here, a massive identity conflict as Americans. Like, are we gonna be a country of immigrants, or are we gonna be more of a Christian based morality nation? Which kind of ties into that Indian Revolution again, where they wanted something that was a little more in line with what they thought morally. They have a different culture completely, a different religion. So their morals were a little bit different. And seeing this giant shift from more of a Christian morality, which the UK had at that time, to something completely different gave them a bit of an identity crisis. And this one didn't have a whole lot of violence, which is something that's very, very unique when it comes to revolutions. That's something we could kind of get here if we can get through the little bit of an old guard to new guard shift. We're going to see administrative problems, but some of these are needed. We see a lot of problems with the way that the federal government runs, and we really highlighted that at the beginning of the show when we were asking the questions, ticking those revolutionary boxes about what needs to happen. What is the government not doing, and what should the government be doing? So India's more of your interesting revolution that I would hope we could see more here in America, with less violence and more of a peaceful transfer from one way of doing things to a new way of doing things.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight, like you said, less violence. There was still violence, which was interesting in India's case because it was long. It was, more crossed on morals because of the change of ideology in the country. It was mass. It was huge. The entire country was involved, but there was still bloodshed at the end of it. And that's, it's interesting to note that because they tried so long to find something that worked, and it eventually led to violence. And that is something that is interesting to note, is where is that tipping point? Especially in India's case, I mean, there was a lot of stress on the country, because of war again, um, lack of food. I remember that there was a bread protest there, that was huge by the masses. There was another 100,000, I believe, in protests there. And then there was mass arrests that happened as well. All of that stress combined still made it through no violence. And then just at the tipping point at the end, there was a little bit of violence, because there wasn't enough change without it. It was almost like the country felt no one was paying attention. They tried for so long and just didn't feel heard, and there was actions at the end of it. And that's something I believe that we could get through in our country, hopefully without, ideally no violence. But at some certain point, if the common voice doesn't feel heard, there's always a stronger action.
Hmm. And like that's really what we highlighted here at the beginning of the show. That revolution, it's it's one of the only ways that you can fully remove the old the old systems of power. But the biggest part of it is that it's not a peaceful way to do things. It is a definite answer, but sometimes, you don't need permanent solutions to temporary problems. But where you do see those permanent solutions coming about is when you're not being heard about the temporary problems. And that's really what you see in all of these, especially in some place like Cuba, where, we've heard it a bunch here, where it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. You go left, and they complained about Donald Trump and not being, the legitimate president. You heard it with that first term. You heard it with Obama, where he wasn't the legitimate president. You heard it with Biden, where it was rigged. You heard it with Hillary when Hillary lost. Oh, it was rigged. It was a rigged election. It was stolen. And both sides are kind of feeling that voting is useless, which is part of that problem where we highlighted where is the legitimacy of the government really there? Are we checking that box? Do the people actually feel that the government is fully representing them in all aspects of life? And I would say no. And what do you do when you can't vote and change something that you feel needs to be changed?
Well, yeah, and like you touched on there, is the government really, is our government actually doing what is best for the people? And is it our government? So just like you touched on with Cuba, that was one of the big issues. There was so much foreign pressure from other countries outside of Cuba. People felt like it wasn't Cuba's government wasn't running the show. I mean, I have some quick stats. The US actually had so much dominance in the Cuban market. It was 90% of the mines, 80% of the utilities, 40% of sugar, which was their number one exported resource, as well as 25% of bank deposits for the country were US. So
Mhm.
the US was controlling banking, farming, exportation, their resources and minerals. I mean, at that point, do the people even feel like the Cuban government has any say, or are they just paid pieces to stand up and say that they're doing these things? And that's what kind of started off with the Cuban Revolution. There was a huge coup, huge, between it was the Batista regime, and we all know how Fidel Castro ended up kind of working through that whole issue. The guerrilla warfare. There was just, I mean, the country was divided, the governments were divided. There was little sectional cliques that formed. It was, I mean, in the truest form ever, a multi-group civil war.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar to some of the issues that are going on here in America. You have, like you highlighted before, Minnesota really, really resisting that federal power. They didn't want the National Guard there. California, same kind of thing. You have a few other states as well that are kind of pulling that same line there. And it's really, they're not all in line with each other. They're a little bit different. And it's really showing something that Cuba had there too, where it started out as just 82 people. All it took to really start the overthrow of their government was 82 people. Castro and 81 other people attacking the government. They started out with an attack on some military barracks, which would ironically enough ended up being a July kind of thing. There's a lot of correlation here, and a lot of these revolutions, July being a key date there, but they ended up mostly getting killed or captured, and a very, very small part of them ended up being able to escape. And they survived for 3 years. And in those 3 years, they built up that guerrilla network that you talked about. They really, really expanded, talking to the people, growing up that revolutionary spirit until it was just a massive momentum that the Batista government just couldn't put down anymore.
Yeah, and in Cuba's example, that was when Batista, who was the leading regime that Fidel was trying to overthrow, he actually ended up fleeing the country.
Mhm.
In the end, after everything was said and done, and all they went through all of this trouble, and the barrack storming, the the guerrilla wars, the cliques. It didn't even change with a capture, kill. He left. He said, "All right, you know what? This has been enough for me. You can have it." And
Mhm.
and to be honest, he gave him a country that was torn, distraught, financially unstable, had so much foreign interest. Again, it didn't feel like a country. It felt more like a pawn on the chessboard. And that left the people in a very vulnerable state that Castro took over.
Yeah, and it was not a beautiful takeover either, which is something we've seen in several of these revolutions now, which, kind of brings about that second talk when it comes to revolution. Is revolution, always the needed answer? When governments aren't listening to you and they won't do what you're asking them to, and they're not following the will of the people, and they don't have legitimacy, and they can't keep control of the country, you're not providing people the basics. Whereas in right now, it's not food that people are really complaining about, unless you're on like more of the lower end of finances. You're not bringing in a whole lot of money. People aren't really complaining about food. Our big complaint here is housing, which has not been a complaint we've really ever seen before when it comes to revolutions. But you kind of see the answer trying to be answered by our current administration, but there's too much of, like you said, with Cuba, outside influence. And these aren't outside countries, these are outside entities where some of the biggest corporations ever just won't allow it to change. Your banking institutions, your big investment groups, this is a big part of what's keeping those people feeling like they're tied into these class-based systems, which we talked about last time. 70% of the wealth is owned by 10% of the people, the biggest wealth inequality gap we've ever seen before. And what this has led to in more of our recent time is you've got Armenia throwing a non-violent revolution in their country. You've got Algeria with sustained protest and forcing their leader to resign. You've got Sudan with protests and the military backing them, like in Russia, and overthrowing their government. You've got Sri Lanka, who had an economic crisis. You had mass mobilization, and they forced their president to resign. And then you had Bangladesh, where, like in Cuba, they mobilized with massive protest and they forced their leader to flee the country. And these are just the more peaceful ones. We've also seen things like in Madagascar, where they absolutely destroyed the entire country, burned things down, killed people, and then the youngest people in that country took control of the government. Is it needed or is it not needed? We're at that tipping point here in history, and we're seeing it all over the globe.
Yeah, I think so. My favorite analogy ever is the light bulb analogy. And you can relate it. A lot of people are car guys or car girls. They like to relate it to old cars or new cars. So the light bulb analogy is when the light bulb was made, it's fun fact, there's a light bulb out there that has been running consistently for like 100 years. They've never turned it off. It's never burned out. It just runs. Now, you and I both know you go buy a light bulb right now at your local hardware store, you go plug it in, you're lucky to get what, 5 years, maybe 10 if it's a good light bulb. Why is that? Well, the answer is if the light bulb distributors, the light bulb companies, made light bulbs that never broke, you'd never buy any more. So they have to make it so eventually it is not as good or it does not function. Same with cars. There is cars that you can go buy that's an 80s or 90s model that, I mean, well over 500, 600,000 miles on that car before you start having some problems. Nowadays, you're lucky to get 30,000, maybe 60,000, and then you got a problem. So it's, and then you look at our government, compare that to the government or nonprofit organizations. If their goal really was to solve the problems they're out there to solve, they wouldn't have an organization. If if the government really wanted to solve issues between welfare, housing, equality, disparity, I mean, food, medicine, pricing, if they really wanted to solve those issues, they could. But if they solved them, you know what they'd have to do? Lower taxes, because then they don't need that much money. They don't need the amount of income coming in to solve the problems because they've already solved them. So it's the more they tack on and the more they make things unsolvable, the longer they stay there, the longer they get to continue to raise inflation, raise prices that make it harder for our people, our citizens to become independent, become wealthy, or have socially elite status. It makes it harder. So it's interesting to see is, do they really want to make these things better? Do at the expense of their own existence? Because if America functioned how it was supposed to, if every person got a vote and every voice was worth the same, and we were a true democracy, there would be a lot less government.
Mhm. Well, there'd be a lot less government at the federal level.
Yeah,
There'd be more government at the state level. And eventually, an episode that we're going to do is how we restructure the government to be more like our founding fathers intended. And I do think there needs to be a few changes on that. I think a big part of why we're at this real tipping point of why we're seeing uh, potential for revolution, or as you've seen more in headlines, potential for civil war, is that a lot of this power is consolidated at the federal government. And a lot of your American people are not at a consensus for how the federal government really needs to run. Whereas if you had more of these things solved at the local level, we wouldn't have as much friction. I don't care as much how California decides to do their healthcare, as long as I'm able to have my healthcare and it's not absolutely expensive. But you're not really seeing that. We have this Medicare system and everyone's got to pay into it, and it's not very efficient. It absolutely screwed up the rest of your insurance industry. So like these are all problems that have caused massive tipping points. It's what shut the government down last time. When if we would just hand this at more of a localized level or a regional level, we wouldn't see these incohesive uh, problems really causing massive problems at your federal level. You wouldn't have California angry at Texas. You wouldn't have Florida angry at Minneapolis about how they're doing things. You just do it how you're doing it, and as long as you're not screwing with me, I'm not screwing with you.
yeah. I mean, our original federal government, the original Constitution, wasn't made to govern the amount of people it currently is. It wasn't structured to govern. I mean, it was structured to govern states and colonies that were closely related, all in a regional area, and then it quickly spread. It's like a very, very poor franchise system. If there's not processes and procedures to adequately spread, it falls apart.
Mhm.
And all we've seen is band-aids here, fix that leak there, fix that leak there, and there is no cohesion. It's a fight for yourself, fight for all, instead of a let's make sure we're all working together on a centralized goal. It That's 100% true. It is unfortunate because it almost is like there has to be an extreme makeover of the entire thing to get what everyone wants. It's almost like there's too much to stop. There's too many bad habits, too many plugged holes. Scrap the whole ship and build a new one.
Mhm. Well, and there's two real ways to do this, and one of those is revolution, and one of those is kind of like regime change. And both of those can come about the same way through revolution, or you can have your American populace who is standing up, really saying no, not violently saying no, but just saying no, that we no longer accept this, that you are no longer the legitimate government, and that we are taking back control, that we are deciding here in California and here in Texas and here in Florida and here in New York that we're just going to do things a little bit differently. But you can still have your federal power, you can still do interstate commerce, and you can still protect the borders, and you can still have your military that makes sure that we are safe from foreign attacks and domestic attacks. But at a more structural level, we want to do things ourselves. I don't think that the federal government should be dictating education. Maybe it handles roadways, which is something it does extremely poorly right now. When it's like you have all of these things and you do all of them extremely poorly, so why do we need you?
Yeah, I mean, and so I've actually thrown this point around, and it has mixed opinions. Um, but I think that it's, you know, you should think about it. What if we had a constitutional coherency test that allowed you to vote? Because right now it's you hit a certain age and you go and register to vote, you're allowed to vote. What if instead it was you have to show that you have competency of not only the federal constitution, the Constitution of the United States, but also your state constitution? And you really understood what it takes to pass laws, to get rid of laws, what laws are in place, who the correct people are to advocate for changing certain aspects of your local and federal government. If that was required, I feel like people would be a lot more, they would be easier to identify what they want changed and how to do it. And that I think is something that, I mean, I can't believe that our government doesn't fund constitutional education. It is one of the biggest, I think, drop balls ever. And maybe that's by design. They don't want you to become educated in the constitutions. But that is something I've thrown out there. And it is eye-opening when people actually realize what your state can do or can't do, what your federal government can and can't do. It changes the game.
Hmm. Well, and part of this is whether you have direct representation or if more of these representatives are, you know, we're in this position to do this job, and we're supposed to make the best choices on what we think is best for y'all. And I don't think that that system has been working out too well, especially when you have more of an uneducated voter base. And this is something we'll get into a little heavier when we do that. How do we restructure the government? But I definitely agree that voting should be more of a limited right. I think you need skin in the game if you're going to be voting. I think you need to understand some of these things if you're going to be voting. So we'll get into that a little bit more on that episode. And you are free to join us for it, Zach, because I know that is a biggie. And I think all of us have more problems with how our government is structured, how it is currently running, and how far we've come away from our current mission. We do have more of a government that's kind of matured, but in some ways, I don't think it's matured for the better. We are going to have a big welfare state, and that just is what it is. But I think your welfare state would work a whole lot better if this is California taking care of Californians, and here in Nebraska, we're Nebraskans taking care of Nebraskans. Or maybe more of a regional where it's like, hey, Iowa's pretty similar to me, and Kansas is pretty similar to me, and South Dakota is pretty similar to me. And all together as a region, we come together and we're like, yeah, we have a little bit of a welfare state. We could probably afford to do more of a basic universal health care if we came together as a people like that. It's not going to work at a federal level. The federal government can't even manage its healthcare system now. So
Yeah, it's a more unionized approach. And I mean, in reality, when you think about it, it probably is one of the better decisions and solutions. Um, just because, I mean, yeah, the people closest to you probably more closely resemble what the common idea for that area is. And so I could see, and as well as you can then be more concentrated on the problems in your regional area. Problems they have, we don't have in the Midwest problems with border security. That's not an issue here. So, we can better allocate resources towards education reform and homeless community, as well as welfare, healthcare, things that are more predominantly issues here than for say Texas, which might have a very big issue and problem with border security. They need to pour more money there, but the lower tax rates help them with housing and help them with welfare and all of the other problems that aren't so predominantly big there. So I think, yeah, regional does make a lot of sense. I don't think it's a forever fix, and the federal government would hate it. They would hate,
Yeah.
unionized populations, because then it's much harder to convince when there is masses pulled together all with the same ideology. So it's an interesting idea.
But like a big part of that is it's like you wouldn't need a strong federal government if you had these strong states. Well, you can't have these strong states if these strong states aren't relying on each other, if these strong states aren't working together with each other. And that'll keep you from actually needing that federal government. Where it's like California needs to pay into the system so that Missouri can have good schools. Well, if Missouri just partnered with the states in its area, they could probably tackle this problem. And then you wouldn't need the federal government to be involved in that issue. And I think this is a way that we could kind of keep from having revolutions. One of the big things that the federal government was supposed to do anyway is handle interstate commerce. Well, that sounds like interstate commerce to me. You know, force these states to kind of work together. Hey, you Georgia and you Alabama and you South Carolina, you guys are a little bit similar. You got these similar problems here. So how about you guys work together? You get this from this state, you get this from this state, you get this from this state. Well, all together, now you guys fixed all of those problems, and you don't need big daddy government to come in here and govern you harder, which is a big part of the problem that we're at this tipping point anyway.
Yeah, no, and people would also feel like they have more of a say. If you are not playing, prayers to the sky that your electoral college candidate votes your way for presidency, or you are, praying to the sky that your voice is being heard in your local elections. You have more of a reason to be accurately involved in your community and want to make it better. I would love to go out there and change my community that I live in. Unfortunately, I know that there's no way of doing that. There is absolutely no amount of financial, giving or even visibility in my community that will actually change anything on a large scale, because eventually someone will come in with either more resources or more backing or more something, undermine everything, and you're back to square one. So it's like demoralizing to know that there's nothing you can do, and it's because the system is too large.
Oh, definitely. And one thing that's really highlighted by some of the older political thinkers when it comes to libertarianism is if something can't be done well at the local government level, it's not going to be done well at the federal level. It's just not. It's not how it works. If something can't be done to scale unless it can be done at the smallest scale. So we need to try a lot of these things at the smallest scale and maybe grow it out a little bit, go regional, force people to actually be involved in their local communities instead of worrying about what the federal government is doing all of the time. Because us worrying about the federal government all of the time and not worrying about what's actually going on locally is causing more of this fracture. We are more divided than ever because we are more diverse than ever, and we need a little bit of some different governance. And the federal government ruling over it all is not a very effective way of actually acknowledging the diversity that we have here in America.
Yeah, and the interesting thing you said there was we're more diverse than ever, we're more divided than ever. But you know what it takes to change the government? Unionized thinking, cohesion, the majority. So it's really funny that it's a catch 22. It's the exact thing that we need to make change we can't get. Or it's, again, there's so much division that people would rather have enemies than find common ground to solve the issues. And it's the biggest lie of all is you can change this if you really want to. You advocate enough. But in reality, if you don't have majority, and not majority by slim margins, majority, there is no change.
Hmm. And of course, that's not going to work at the federal level at all because we're so diverse. So we need to kick this can back down to our more local levels and solve problems at our local levels where we are more unified. And then together, as our unified states or unified counties, we're coming together. We're finding out what actually worked with the other counties in our state, and now we're petitioning our state government. And now, as a state government, we're more unified. We come together with other states that are like-minded. We formed these pacts. We formed these regional governments that keep the federal government still strong in the aspects it's needed, but out of our daily lives. And then we could get a little bit of cohesion because now we're not fighting to solve all these little problems at a federal government level. We've already solved those problems with our local community members, and now we could try to tackle some of the big issues that maybe the federal government should be handling. Like maybe at that point we're strong economically and we could be like, hey, well, now let's tackle this immigration issue, which we will talk about more tomorrow. And it's like maybe we can bring in some people. Maybe because we're unified as a state, we could bring in some people from a different country and we can show them the American way of life. And they would go back to their country not being like, well, America's like a crazy place, you know? They might be like, wow, America's got their shit together and we should be like America. Because countries already want our freedoms. They want freedom of religion. They want the freedom to say what you want to say. They want the freedom to property. They want all of these things. Our government is the most replicated government around the world. And we need to get back to that. We need to get back to being a cohesive country that even though we have differences of opinions, as long as the problems are differences at local levels that don't really impact the way another state is going to run, that we can agree that we're both American, and even though we solved the problem differently, the problem is solved and we can focus on the big picture.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't think the federal government will ever let us get to that point. Because it's not a good model for them. If the more, let's say, 5 states group up, the more that you have centralized in an idea, the harder it is for them to gain and have control. And that's something that I think is a real issue, is they don't want to lose control. They want to be able to be the ultimate law and rule makers, which could still be a possibility under a unionized country, but it's scary to them because revolution then becomes a lot fucking easier. Excuse
Hmm.
my language for anyone watching, but it's a lot easier for people to stand up against tyranny or difference of opinion when you have more of a backing. So it'll be very interesting to see if that's even a possibility, because I don't think they'd let it get to that point. I think they see in the future, they say this looks bad for us, because then if we don't stay in line with what these unionized regional sections of states that have all pulled together and said this is what we want, if they don't stay aligned with it, who's telling what happens?
No, the one thing I would have to say to the federal government not liking it, screw them. You're the reason we're in this problem. I get you don't like it, but if you had done what you were supposed to do, you wouldn't be in this position. And it is written in it to our Constitution that we have the power to challenge the authority of our government, the legitimacy of our government. That's why we have the Second Amendment. It's the pretty much the only reason that the Second Amendment was written in there, because they understood that absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, and that is the scariest idea of everything we've discussed, is that is the ultimate be all end all, which is, if they don't want to play game, play ball, and humor the American people with a different way of governing and a different structure, it's there. And then the question is when does the government decide, even though this is a right, this is a constitutional right that we are supposed to abide by, when do they decide not to?
Mhm. Yep, it is. It is the scariest part. I do think we did a whole series on how we build community, how we scale the community up. That's part. We did a three-parter on that. And if you really want to see some of this stuff change, and you really want to kind of keep things from being a bloody revolution, this is what we need to do. You need to build up your local community at the smallest levels first. Find out who your neighbor is. Talk to your neighbor. Find out what they want for the local community. Together as your local community, go and petition your local government. My girl just sat in at one of the meetings that they have with senators who are on the Department of Health here, because they're looking at making some changes. And everyone at her job went there and they petitioned the government. That is your responsibility if you want to see your government change. But you can't do this without a like-minded community. So build up your local community. Get that thing strong so that you can go and enact change. And then make sure that that change is kept in power by keeping your local community in strong, so that you can keep that in check. We can't allow this to continue the way it has been, because we know where it goes. If we allow the trajectory that we're on now of division and incohesive thoughts and incohesive leadership and people at each other's throats with the most divisive rhetoric that we have ever seen in our political history, this is only going one way. And I would prefer the absolute best for my fellow Americans, even if they don't agree with the way I think. But you need your strong local communities, you need your strong state communities, and you need a strong community at our federal level. Even if we're just a little bit different, we need to solve the problems at the smallest levels and then work our way up.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to solve the problem. That is the end goal, and there's multiple ways to get there. Now, the cleanest, easiest, and quite frankly, the best is exactly what you said. Get involved in your local community, build up groups of like-minded people, invite challenge, invite disagreement. Don't fight it. Don't run away from it. It's challenge it. It is great to have discussions and difference of opinion, because you get to see all sides. And everyone has had a different experience with the same experiences. That is it's a quote that has been told to me over years and years and years by my grandpa, which is, everyone has a different experience with the same experience. And because of that, there's always multiple ways to see the same issue. So get out to your local community, build up like-minded people, invite challenge, show up to your local, chamber of commerce, your local town hall meetings, your mayoral meetings, you know, protest peacefully, and to touch on protests just for a second. If you think protesting at neighborhoods and at, you know, community events is the way to protest, it's not. The way to protest is to go show up to your governor's doorstep, your mayor's doorstep, or town hall, city hall, or hall of justice, and peacefully protest, because nothing gets more media attention, as well as, you know, return on your
Positive
yeah,
reactions.
positive reaction, yeah, for sure, than standing in front of the people who actually make that change. If you are protesting anywhere other than kind of those areas, to the people who actually make decisions, it just looks like a bunch of people who are emotionally activated and taking action. But when it starts affecting their day-to-day life and saying, wow, these people really mean something because they've been outside my office for 4 days straight with the same ideology, and there's a large group of them, it invites them to at least challenge the idea that they might not be doing something right. But if you're spread out and it's uncoordinated as well as not peaceful, it loses all of the power. So if you really are passionate about an idea and you have like-minded people that you want to make a change with, the best way to do it is to march down to your representatives in office and show them that it means that much to you.
Hmm. Make your voice heard, and make sure that that action is followed through with. You know, go back and make sure that they actually did what they said they were going to do. Hold these people accountable. But it's the only way that we're going to get peaceful change in America. And I think we've seen enough violence in our more local time period that, we're at that tipping point. Do we want violence in our country? Do we want our fellow Americans to have to die for change? Or do we want to come together, even though we might have differences of opinions, and solve the issues and become a strong American country again?
Yeah,
That's
and it also, a lot of these other revolutions didn't have a choice.
Mhm.
We are in a very, very unique point of time, especially with our old guard to new guard political changing, as well as the day and age of all of these issues between legitimacy, capacity, and cohesion. We have a perfect mixture of we actually have a choice. It's, do we as an American people decide to stand up and do what we know needs to happen through this next new guard, old guard change of regime in political names? And if we choose not that option, there's only one left on the table. But these other revolutions didn't have options. They were at their last resort. So it's really, really up to the American people. We get to decide our own fate. It's do it the right, correct, peaceful way, or do nothing, and we're stuck with the worst of the two.
Most definitely. Thank you, Zach, for coming on this episode. I really liked that we got to touch a little bit deeper on the revolutionary aspects of our last conversation. Even though, there was a little bit of some tough conversations in it, I really think these conversations need to be had, because if we don't have these conversations, there is only one alternative. And we're at that point where we make one of two decisions, and that's action or inaction, and get the worst that we could possibly have imagined. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I really enjoy these conversations. I'm always down to get deep and dirty, and the uncomfortable conversations usually are the best ones. And I wish and I invite people to have more of them. It is a day and age where if we could get past these being politically correct, as well as having these tough conversations with our neighbors, I think people would find out that you actually have a lot more in common than you believe. It's you guys are fighting against the same problems in different rhetorics.
Hmm.
Realize with your neighbor that you guys have a common theme and you have a similar problem, and that you guys can come to a common solution. And I believe that we have a fighting chance to change our country.
I would definitely agree. Well, everyone, thanks for tuning in for part two of Revolution. If you like this video, give us a little bit of a thumbs up, share it out with your local community, share it out with the people that need to hear it, and let us know in the comments what you think about this topic. If you like what you're hearing and you want to hear something specific, let us know in the comments as well. We are happy to tackle almost anything actually pretty much anything. There's no topic I am not happy to talk about. So until next time, you guys have a great rest of your week, and we will see you at the next one.
Counter this, counter that. Freedom's more than tit for tat. Words can build or words can break. Speak the truth for all our sake. A hand that feeds can also bind, but peace can free a restless mind. Fix the cracks, don't paint them bright. The world's not whole without the fight. So rise and speak, don't just comply. Change the script, don't live the lie. Counter this, counter that.